Hello, my name is Richard Ebeling, and I'm the BB&T Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is Economic Straight Talk, sponsored by the Future of Freedom Foundation. What I would like to talk about today is trade retaliation, the potential of trade wars, and free trade. The United States is currently threatened with the potential emergence of trade wars with some of our leading trading partners, the European Union, China. Why is this the case? It is basically because the President of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump, has argued that those countries are treating American exporters unfairly. That is, that those European trading partners or our Chinese trading partners impose higher tariffs or import taxes on American goods entering their lands than we impose on their goods entering the United States. And he says, therefore, American businesses are losing business that could have been theirs, yet the Europeans and the Chinese are able to gain more business in America because our tariff import taxes on their goods are lower. And to teach them a lesson, to try to change their behavior, he has said that he is going to impose a series of retaliatory import duties that will be higher and more extended over more goods coming from the European Union or from China. Now, it is true that if the United States imposes new or raises existing import taxes, that will make it more expensive for those foreign producers and manufacturers to sell their goods in the United States. They will have to raise the prices of their goods. Why so? Well, if you're a manufacturer in the European Union or China, you have your production costs. You have your transportation expenses to get your good across the Pacific from China or across the Atlantic from some of the European nations. And now you have an additional expense to sell your product in the United States of the import tax that you have to pay at point of entry. Now that's raising the cost of production of those foreign manufacturers. And to cover all of their expenses, they will end up tagging a good part, if not all, of that tax on the price of the good they sell in the U.S. Now, as a result of this, since their good is going to be more expensive, they will likely see a decrease in the demand for their exports. We all know commonsensically that if a product or that we desire goes higher in price, we tend to buy less of it, all other things staying the same. And so those Chinese and European exporters might very well find that their demand for their good decreases, their revenues decline, their profits are smaller, and they may have to let some of their workers off because there's reduced business due to American consumers buying less of their commodities. But that is not the end of the story. And in fact, that's only part of the story. And if we follow the steps of the story, we realize that the end result of these retaliatory trade restrictions is, in fact, for the United States government to be harming its own consumers and its own manufacturers even more than it will harm the foreign exporters that the U.S. government wishes to punish. Why? Well, as I said, the foreign exporter who's selling his goods in the United States has his manufacturing expenses, his transportation costs, and now the higher import tax that he pays on entering the U.S. That's going to be tagged on, as I said, to the price of his good, either all or a good part of it. And as a result, if the American consumer wants to buy that foreign good, he's going to pay a higher price. In fact, the American consumer ends up paying all of that higher price of the tax at the end of the day. Either the foreign version is more expensive, or substituting an American version of that product instead, he'll end up paying a higher price for the American substitute. Why is that the case? Because in many cases, the domestic producer was losing out on business to the Chinese or European manufacturer because his domestic costs of production were higher. He couldn't match the price competitiveness of the Chinese or European seller. But now with the import tax imposed on the foreign good, he doesn't have to work as hard to match that former lower import price. He can now charge the higher price as a higher cost producer to the domestic American consumers. So whether it's paying more for the imported good or paying more for the domestic version of the good, at the end of the day, American consumers will be paying the full price of the import tax. That's a redistribution of wealth from American consumers to either a domestic producer who can now charge a higher price for his version of the product, or paying a higher price to the foreign manufacturer who's now incorporating the tax into his selling price. But that isn't the end of the day with this. It's also the fact that American producers will be negatively affected in various ways. While we are a big country and have a large economy and produce a lot right here at home, the fact is we do import quite a bit of resources, raw materials, component parts into our manufacturing processes. And if those import duties are imposed, well, the cost of importing resources, raw materials, component parts for the production processes go up. And that means the cost of production for domestic manufacturers will increase. And they'll basically pass along most or a good part of that higher manufacturing expense. So those domestically produced goods are going to cost more when sold to American consumers. And those American producers, when they want to export some of their output, with the now higher import costs embedded in their manufacturing processes, will find themselves less competitive on the international markets. That will have a negative effect on those American producers, a lower demand, less revenue, reduced profits, the loss of some jobs. At the end of the day, the cumulative effect on American consumers and American producers will usually outnumber, have a greater magnitude of impact on the citizens of the United States than the negative impact on the foreign exporters that Trump is attempting to punish. Now, in the late 19th century, there was a British economist named Henry Dunning MacLeod, and he tried to explain the fallacy of retaliatory trade barriers in the following way. He said, let us suppose that the French impose a trade barrier against some British goods. That's equivalent to the French government slapping the British manufacturer on the face. British manufacturer loses jobs, revenues and profits go down. Some British workers may lose their job in those export sectors of the British economy. But then what does the British government do with retaliation? It hits itself on the other cheek. And by the way, that did hurt in using this example. They hit themselves on the other cheek even harder than the foreigner has slapped you on the face, because you're now making it more costly for your own consumers, more costly for your own manufacturers to produce for the domestic demand or for the foreign export of their goods. And therefore the result of such retaliatory tariffs is to do your own citizens more harm than anything you do to the foreign exporter and the foreign government that you say you want to punish. What then should be a wise trade policy for the United States? And I would like to suggest free trade. If another country imposes a trade barrier against the United States, the U.S.'s policy should be to do nothing. You can't control that foreign government. You can't influence in any direct way the fact that some domestic manufacturer in that country has asked for a trade barrier to restrict American goods coming into their country. That's domestic politics. All that you can do by imposing a retaliatory trade barrier is maybe limiting some of their exports to the United States, but in the process harming far more consumers who buy that product, making the foreign version more expensive, or making it necessary for the domestic American consumers to be paying a higher price from the domestic manufacturers, and to make it more expensive for American producers to acquire the resources, raw materials, and component parts which are part of their own manufacturing expenses, and therefore making them less competitive both at home and abroad. The best policy, therefore, is free trade. Everyone loses by these retaliatory wars. The European Union, the Chinese have said, If the U.S. imposes these trade barriers, as Donald Trump has said, they're going to retaliate. And they have already started retaliating. And what does Donald Trump reply to that? Oh, yeah? Well, we're going to impose even more tariffs on more of your goods and raise them even higher. Now, what happens then if the Chinese and the European Union countries say, oh, yeah, and we're going to retaliate with even higher and more restrictions on you than you've now countered against us? You then have a downward spiraling of lost trade, lost business, lost profits, lost jobs, reduced efficiency of taking advantage of the international division of labor. The whole purpose of trade is to gain something from another that either you can't produce for yourself or you could only produce at a higher expense than he can offer it to you instead. If we impose these trade barriers, we lose those opportunities. Some goods we won't get. Some other goods will now be more costly for us, either to buy from them or to produce at home. Our standards of living are reduced. The variety and the qualities of the goods either stagnate or actually decline. And the drive of competition, not just to stay ahead of your domestic rivals. Oh, he's nipping at my heels. I better try to be innovative, make a better product, a less expensive product, an improved product, a new product. You reduce some of that competitive incentive by limiting what is coming in from the foreign countries. And therefore you reduce the motive, the incentive, and the drive for innovation improvement in your own country's standard of living while making it stagnate with lost business, fewer imports, fewer exports, and therefore a poorer country. At the end of the day, the best policy is free trade, even when other countries choose to follow other trade restricting paths. All you do is after they've slapped you on one cheek is to slap yourself on the other even harder. Understanding that is something that Donald Trump does not fully seem to understand. What he really needs is some economic straight talk. And that is what this has been about. Thank you for listening. This has been sponsored by the Future of Freedom Foundation. To find out more about the Foundation's work, please go to fff.org, as well as its site for YouTube videos such as these on economic and foreign and political policy issues, all from the perspective of the individualist philosophy of freedom, limited government, and free markets. Thank you for joining us.